Right, hi everyone, it's Jason here. I'm joined again by Rabbi Stuart Federer, author of Judaism and Christianity at Contrast, which you can buy in a load of places. There'll be a link under this video. You should definitely go and get that. It's really only pocket money for a ton of content. And from that book, we are discussing some of the most used verses which Christians use to prove Jesus, which are taken out of context. And I think this week we're starting at the biggest probably hitter, Isaiah 53. So I think we should just jump in and fill this with as much good stuff as we can. Like I said, if you haven't got the book, go and get it. It's brilliant. You can get it on Kindle if you like electric, and you can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and a load of other places if you like it in paper. But where do you want to start?
Well, let me first tell you a story. Tell everybody a story. Jesus was in heaven, and one day he decided he wanted to see his earthly father, and so he went to the section of heaven reserved for carpenters. And he looked around and he saw a man that looked vaguely familiar, and he walked up to him and he starts engaging him in conversation. And in the course of the conversation, he says to the man, "By the way, did you have any children?" And of course at this, the carpenter brightens up and he says, "Why, yes, I had a son who was very, very special." And at this, Jesus starts brightening up. He says, "Really? Tell me about him." So the carpenter says, "Well, he came into the world where everybody thought he began as human, but he really didn't. He had holes in his hands and his feet, and he died and he came back to life." At this, Jesus yells, "Father!" And the carpenter goes, "Pinocchio!" Because if you listen to the story of Pinocchio, he sounds like it's Jesus, because Pinocchio came into the world as a wooden boy, but actually turned out to be human. They thought he was human, but he actually didn't start out that way. Pinocchio had holes in his hands and his feet because he was actually a marionette originally, if you read the original story in the Italian. And thirdly, he died and came back to life. He died, and the blue fairy brought him back to life as a real boy.
And he spent some time inside a whale?
And he spent time inside of a whale.
Yeah, like that's the sign of Jonah right there.
Right, which was supposed to be a supposed type thingy for the Christians. And actually, one could argue that the author was using the images of Jesus to write the story of Pinocchio. Keep that in mind as we go along with this. But my point is that something may begin to sound like something, but if you look at the details of both the original story and the person it sounds like it's about, you'll see that they don't match, and therefore they cannot be one and the same. And that is exactly what we find with Isaiah 53. If you just glance through it, it may sound like Jesus, but if you look at the details of Isaiah 53 and you look at the details from the Christian's New Testament, the details of Jesus' life, it becomes evident that they cannot be one and the same.
It's interesting as well, before we start, that Jesus never references Isaiah 53. And Peter never references Isaiah 53. It's really only after the death of Jesus. Now, one time, I think Philip meets the Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian says, "Who's this person talking about in Isaiah?" It's the only time it's ever referenced, and it's way after the life.
Of course.
So it's clearly retrofitted.
When Peter is told, that by Jesus, of what Jesus intends to do, namely die and save mankind, Peter's response is, "Far be it from you. How could you think that?" So the whole concept of a dying, saving Messiah isn't the concept that they held until well after Jesus was dead and buried. Okay, so to believing fundamentalist Christians, Isaiah 53 may sound like the perfect description of the life and death of Jesus, and because it's so perfect a description, they feel that Jesus must have been the Messiah. Now, some of these fundamentalist Christians are told that this is so perfect a description of Jesus that the Jews are forbidden to read it. And I'm sure you've seen that stupid video where they go up to ignorant Israelis and take advantage of their ignorance.
Yeah, I just want to say now, so in a regular synagogue service, we've got Torah portions that make up the whole Torah. One of those is read per week. And generally there's one portion of the Haftarah too, right?
Absolutely.
Right, so that's the only, maybe 8 or 9, sometimes 12 verses of a chapter or two, which makes up a tiny portion of what is read in the synagogue.
80% of the entire Nach, or just the prophets, I should say, about 80% are never read. You know,
But they are at Hebrew school, right? When your kid goes to Hebrew school, he goes through the whole book.
yes, it goes through the whole book, right? And for the Torah portions, we read all 54 passages. So beginning to end, Genesis 1:1 to the end of Deuteronomy, we're reading it. And we'll get to this. But there's a reason why Isaiah 53 was never chosen. So no part of the Jewish Bible, they'll say that it was avoided. We're told the Jews read from the prophets every week. But the 53rd chapter of Isaiah was intentionally left out of those readings because the rabbis knew that Jesus was actually the Messiah, and so they wanted to keep it from their followers, from their congregation. Well, that's kind of stupid, because if the rabbis really believed in Jesus or really felt he was the Messiah, they wouldn't wish their congregants to go to hell. So the idea that the rabbis really believe secretly, but they want to keep it from their congregants, is exceptionally anti-Semitic and insulting. So at any rate, no part, of course, of the Bible was ever censored. You know, people forget that if the Jews wanted to censor any part of the Tanakh, they'd have removed it, because it was the rabbis, actually the rabbis of the early Second Temple period, okay, who chose what was going to be in the Bible in the first place. So if they didn't want the Isaiah 53 to be in it, they'd have removed it. Of course, it's a matter of history, by the way. The Christians were not allowed to read the Bible on their own, and translators of the Bible were killed by the church because they made the Bible accessible to the common people. Now, the reason why Jews don't read Isaiah 53 as part of the Haftarot, as part of the cycle of the year during the weekly service, is because there's no parallels of Isaiah 53 in the Torah. The portion for the prophets called the Haftarah is read only because there was a certain time in Jewish history when the Jews were forbidden by non-Jews to read from the Torah on pain of death. So it was a secret way of letting the Jews know what should have been read from the Torah, and so they picked passages from the prophets that would parallel what was to be read that Shabbat from the Torah. So, for example, take a look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which is clearly the creation story. The section from the prophets chosen to be read is from Isaiah 42, verse 5 through 12, which begins, "Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out." So you come to services, it's time for the Torah reading, but you can't read from the Torah because there might be a soldier who's pretending to be a Jew, and if you start reading from the Torah against the law, he just shuts the door and kills every man, woman, and child in the sanctuary. So it's time to read from the Torah, but you can't read from the Torah. So they read from the prophets, and you hear, "Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out." Oh, I know, we must be in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It's the right time of year for it. That must be where we're at. And then they go home and study it on their own secretly. This probably was in the Maccabean rebellion, by the way. When the Maccabees rebelled and won their freedom from the Hellenized Syrians, they continued the practice of reading from the prophets because it helped enhance the meaning of the Torah portion. And that's why this is why sections for the prophets were chosen. And by the way, if a person were to pick up the Christian's New Testament, they would see that Jesus goes into a synagogue or maybe even the temple, and he's there at the time of the reading of the prophets. So even before Jesus was crucified, dead, buried, they already had picked the passages that would have been read, because this was after the Maccabean rebellion. And so they were already reading the passages that had already been picked, which would have excluded Isaiah 53, because there's nothing in the Torah that it would have paralleled. Now, the only reason Christians are told that the Jews are forbidden to read Isaiah 53, or that Jews don't read Isaiah 53 when they read the prophets, is they can't understand how anybody, much less the Jews, can read Isaiah 53 and not immediately say, "Oh, wow, that sounds like Jesus." And of course, as we will see, there are quite a few reasons why the Jews do not view the prophecy of Isaiah 53 fulfilled in Jesus. If you were to take a look at Isaiah 53 and just read it cold, knowing what you know about Christianity and the beliefs about Jesus, it would sound like it was Jesus. And there's a reason for this. The reason why is because, as any Christian scholar will tell you, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John never knew Jesus. They were floundering for stories to write about him. They took the generally well-known stories of their day which Christian scholars would call as a document, the Q document. But they had all these stories circulating about Jesus, so they wrote it down. And what they didn't know about the life of Jesus, they made up. And when they made it up as a construction worker looks at a blueprint to create the building. But the blueprints to the people who wrote the New Testament is the Hebrew Scriptures. So they would look at the Hebrew Scriptures, see a story written there, and try to make it into a type or shadow or whatever word you want to use, and they would invent a story about Jesus to make it look like Jesus fulfilled this non-prophecy prophecy. And by the way, we have proof of this, okay? And you look at the verses, okay? We're going to look quickly at the story of the entrance of Jesus the first time when he comes into Jerusalem. What I want you to understand as you read through it is that Matthew describes Jesus riding upon two animals, while Mark describes Jesus riding into Jerusalem the first time upon one animal. So this is Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. Matthew 21, verses 1 through 7. And when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethpage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village opposite you, and immediately you will find an ass tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord has need of them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, quote, "Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on an ass, and on a colt, the foal of an ass." The disciples went and did as Jesus directed them. They brought the ass and the colt and put their garments on them, and he, Jesus, sat thereon. So Matthew 21, verses 1 through 7 is clearly describing a scene where Jesus is balancing on two animals. But Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 7, Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 7, is clearly only talking about a single animal. And it reads, "And when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethpage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, 'Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately.' And they went away and found a colt tied at the door, and out in the open street they untied it. And those who stood there said to them, 'Why are you doing untying the colt?' And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments on it, and he sat upon it." Two stories clearly talking about the same incident in Jesus' life. Major distinction of detail is that Matthew speaks of two animals, while Mark speaks of only one. So the question becomes, if they're eyewitness reports, you don't think one of them would notice that Jesus is trying to balance or straddle between two animals? This isn't a case of, oh, it's like two people see an automobile accident, they get some of the details wrong. I think that's kind of a major detail you'd notice if one guy's riding on two separate animals. And these are supposed to be the gospel truth.
And this happened because Matthew didn't understand parallelism, right?
Exactly. As where does this quotation, you may remember that Matthew explicitly said, "This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, 'Tell the daughter of Zion,' and goes on from there." What's he quoting from? He's quoting from Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, although we read from 9 to verse 10. And Zechariah writes, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on an ass, on a colt, the foal of an ass." Goes on from there to say, "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the rivers to the end of the earth." So the question comes up, exactly like you said, Jason, what's he talking about? Was Zechariah talking about one animal or two animals? Matthew understood Zechariah to be talking about two animals, so he invented his story about Jesus, where Jesus rides on two animals. Mark understood Zechariah to be talking about one animal, so he wrote his story about Jesus riding into Jerusalem the first time on one animal. Zechariah as you pointed out, was using typical biblical parallelism, and so he was writing about one animal. He was using the ancient form of poetry, Hebrew poetry, which is a repetition of ideas, using different words to say the same idea, not a repetition or rhyming of sound. That's how they did poetry in the biblical period. Look at almost any psalm and you'll see this clearly. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The precepts of the Lord are right, delighting the mind. It's poetic, obviously it's the Psalms. The law of the Lord is perfect. The precepts of the Lord parallel each other. So that's what Zechariah is doing here. He's using parallelism. And he's writing about one animal. If I said, oh, here's a letter, I want you to mail it at the post office box, the blue one on the corner. So that's two boxes. One is the post office box and one is the blue one on the corner. No. The second clause of the sentence gives more information about the first object. That's what he's doing. That's what parallelism is. And so Zechariah was talking about one animal. Mark understood him correctly to be talking about one animal. So when he invents his story, because he wasn't there to be an eyewitness, he invents a story reflecting what's found in Zechariah 9 the way he understands it. But when Matthew writes his version of the story, he understands Zechariah differently. He understands him to be talking about two animals, so he writes a story about Jesus riding into Jerusalem the first time on two animals. My point is that they make up stories about Jesus and then make them up in a way to make it look like a fulfillment of a biblical description. What comes first is the biblical description, what's in the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. What comes second is the story written about Jesus, invented to make it look like he fulfilled that scripture.
Well, it's interesting that it's because we started off this program talking about how the Haftarah was a parallel of a Torah portion, and how the Torah portion would be the important part that they're trying to get across, but they can't, so they use the parallel in the Haftarah. And now we've got a case where the Christian Bible is making up their own version of this Torah that can't be spoken about by pulling things that they can twist.
Exactly. Or reshape the story to fit what they wanted to reflect. What they didn't know, they made up. And when they made it up based on biblical Hebrew scriptures verses. Again, going back to the Zechariah passage, remember I said Zechariah chapter 9, but also verse 10. Verse 10 read that this person he's talking about, who's coming into Jerusalem, okay, he's going to command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the rivers to the end of the earth. When did Jesus have dominion over anything? Never. And second of all, when it says he shall command peace to the nations, wasn't it Jesus who said, I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set every man against his father, every daughter against her mother, and every daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and your own enemies will be those of your own household. That's not somebody who commands peace. He said, I came not to bring peace. So immediately we see that if Jesus was supposed to be the fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 and 10, he wasn't, because the New Testament itself testifies to the fact that he did exactly the opposite of what Zechariah chapter 9, verse 10 demands. According to Jewish tradition, who was Isaiah speaking about? He's speaking about the people of Israel personified as a servant of God who suffers for God. There's no less than 8 quotations from the book of Isaiah that precede Isaiah 53, so leading up to Isaiah 53, where Isaiah explicitly calls the people of Israel the servant of God. So, for example, Isaiah 41, verse 8, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. Isaiah 44, verse 21, remember these things, O Jacob, and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you, you are my servant, O Israel, and you will not be forgotten by me. Isaiah 45, verse 4, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name, I surname you, though you do not know me. Or Isaiah 49, verse 3, he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. And remember, that's only 4 chapters before the Isaiah 53 passage, where Isaiah speaks that where Isaiah quotes God, and God says to the people of Israel, "You are my servant in whom I will be glorified." Now, other verses, Isaiah 44 verse 1, Isaiah 48 verse 20, Isaiah 49 verse 7. But the most interesting of all is Isaiah chapter 43 verse 10. Because one of the objections that Christians have to the Jewish understanding of Isaiah 53 is, well, Isaiah 53 only speaks of one servant, not many servants. Isaiah speaks of the servant in a singular, and Israel is plural. The people of Israel are numerous. Well, Isaiah 43 verse 10 says the following: "You are my witnesses, saith the Eternal, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, there shall neither be after me." So Isaiah uses two words to refer to the people of Israel. The first word he uses is witnesses, which is clearly plural. And then in the same verse, he says of the same group, "and my servant, singular, whom I have chosen." So in one verse, he uses two words for the people of Israel. One is plural, one is singular. And it's interesting that the singular, the word he uses for the singular, is the same word servant that we're talking about in Isaiah 53.
There's also a really interesting part in the book of Luke where Mary meets her cousin, and she is with child, and Mary gives this kind of blessing to God, and in that she calls Israel the servant of God. In the New Testament, that's awesome. It's like right there in a text, and everyone ignores it.
By the way, there's another thing they ignore regarding that passage. When Mary goes to see Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, Mary is called the kinswoman of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a Levite. If Mary was a kinswoman, it is highly likely that Mary also was from the tribe of Levi, a Levite, and therefore wasn't from the tribe of Judah, like Christians pretend, and therefore Jesus couldn't trace his lineage back through Mary, which he couldn't do anyway because she's a woman. Okay, it's through the father in Judaism. But even if you said it was through Mary, if Mary was a Levite and not from the tribe of Judah, oops, the end. By the way, again with Isaiah 43 verse 10, it states, "Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." But Jesus was formed in the womb of Mary well after Isaiah spoke, hundreds and hundreds of years after Isaiah spoke. So if Jesus was formed in the womb of Mary, he can't be God, because God promises, "Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." From the quotations that we just talked about from Isaiah preceding Isaiah 53, we see that Isaiah is speaking repeatedly of the Jews as the servant of God. So Christian missionaries will make up this claim that Rashi made up this connection between the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 with the people of Israel, that before Rashi, the Jews knew that it was actually the Messiah, and Rashi only made this up to counteract the efforts of Christian missionaries to the Jews. And this is a bold-faced lie, and it can be proved. Look, if I bring you proof from the Jews, a person could say, well, of course, that's what the Jews would say. But the proof actually comes from Christians themselves, that well before Rashi was born, the Jews knew that Isaiah 53 was talking about the people of Israel. Rashi did not make this up. So there's a Christian called Origen. He was a church father. He lived about 800 years before Rashi was born. He wrote a book called Contra Celsum, and in that he writes the following: "I remember that once in a discussion with some whom the Jews regard as learned, I used these prophecies from Isaiah 53. And the Jews said that these prophecies referred to the whole people as though of a single individual, since they were scattered in the dispersion and smitten, that as a result of the scattering of the Jews among the other nations, many might become proselytes." And if you go to earlychristianwritings.com, and you look at Contra Celsum from Origen, and go down to the 55th chapter, chapter LV in the Latin, that's how they do it on that website, you'll read this for yourself. So you have a Christian that lived 800 years before Rashi, referencing Jews then who said that Isaiah 53 was about the people of Israel. And so a Christian himself tells us that this was the common belief long before Rashi came along. So if they say, oh, Rashi made this up, you know that they're lying. Okay. Now we have to take a look at Isaiah 53.
But in the interests of keeping the programs
Yeah, I was about to say, that's why I hesitated.
bite size and to keep people on the edge of their seats, we're not going to do that today. That's going to be in the next show. So you're going to have to tune into the next show, people. But this was an introduction. And, you know, maybe 53 will take a couple of episodes to get through. So thanks very much for...
My pleasure, always is.
For leading us through this. Thanks, you guys. Now, make sure you head over to Amazon and get the book Judaism and Christianity: A Contrast. It's an awesome book. And also head over to the website whatjewsbelieve.org. There's a fabulous amount of information on there. It's all free. You can enjoy it. We've done plenty of series before on these topics as well. You'll be able to find the audio and video series of Judaism, Christianity, Contrast on my YouTube channel, and we did a load of stuff on the New Testament to do with Seder's and Passover. So that's all Rabbi Federo as well. You can go and enjoy that, and we'll see you very soon. Bye bye.